lovely turnout, and I hope that today is a very valuable day to you. My name is Eileen DeRolf. I'm a retired science teacher, and a little less than a year ago, I was like some of you in the audience today who are hearing about Agenda 21 for the first time. I had no idea that we had a cancer in our country that was going to, if we did not give a quick and effective response, perhaps be the death of it. I hope at the end of this speech, you too will decide to be part of this effort to save America for our children and our grandchildren. So what is Agenda 21, also referred to as sustainable development? It is not an environmental movement. It is a political movement which seeks to control the world's economy, dictate its development, and capture and redistribute the world's wealth on a national, state, and local level. The process will lock away the land and resources from use by our citizens and plan a central economy while controlling industry, transportation, food production, water, and the growth, size, and location of the population. Agenda 21 is one of several global plans of action designed to create a coalition of government, business, and non-governmental organizations under the auspices of the United Nations. When fully operational, the system of global governments will command a one world court, a one world army, a one world media, etc., all working in lockstep to gain total control over all human activity and all the Earth's wealth. It is hard to believe that something this sinister could be happening right under our noses. However, it is easier to understand it if you learn how Agenda 21 has been for many decades slowly and steadily implemented. Through the second half of the 20th century, the powers that be in the United Nations were crafting documents and treaties to position themselves to implement Agenda 21. These early efforts led in 1992 to the introduction of 5 key documents at the United Nations Summit in Rio de Janeiro. The 5 documents were the Convention on Climate Change, which was the precursor to the Kyoto Climate Change Protocol, later adopted in 1997. The Biodiversity Treaty, which would declare that massive amounts of land should be off limits to human development. The third document was called the Rio Declaration, which called for the eradication of poverty throughout the world through the redistribution of wealth. The fourth document was the Convention on Forest Principles, calling for the international management of the world's forests, essentially shutting down or severely regulating the timber industry. And the fifth document was the Agenda for the 21st Century, now commonly called Agenda 21. This 300-page document contains 40 chapters that address virtually every facet of the human life and contains great detail on how to implement the concept of sustainable development. It is the how-to document for sustainable development. It was at this summit that President George H.W. Bush, along with 179 other heads of state, signed agreement to Agenda 21. 1 year later, newly elected President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 12582 to create the President's Council on Sustainable Development. This council contained 12 cabinet secretaries. 6 of them belong to at least one of the following: the Nature Conservancy, the Sierra Club, the World Resources Institute, and the National Wildlife Federation. These same groups, called non-governmental organizations, work directly with the United Nations to craft Agenda 21, and now we're in key positions to put Agenda 21 policies through every single agency in the United States federal government. This means every single federal agency, the Department of Education, the Department of Homeland Security, the EPA, all of them are currently using your tax dollars to undercut our sovereignty and steal our property rights bit by bit. The United Nations and the non-governmental organizations that do the heavy lifting for the United Nations have been very clever in the way they have chosen to get people around the world and in the United States to accept sustainable development policies. First, the United Nations created the 3 E's: social equity, economic justice, and environmental justice. in order to justify all that they plan to do in enslaving the world. Social equity says that it is right for all people to benefit equally from the resources provided by society and the environment. In other words, it is necessary for the individual to give up their individual rights for the common good. Taxing the rich to help the poor is one example of social equity. If the 15-member Obamacare advisory panel makes end-of-life decisions for our older citizens in such a way as to perhaps guard the financial resources in order to provide more space and resources for the younger generation, we have to assume social equity is at play. Economic justice says that the wealth of the world has been made at the expense of the poorer countries. To create economic justice, it is critical to redistribute the wealth from the rich country to the poorer countries. It also includes the idea that certain subpopulations have suffered at the hands of their fellow citizens, and therefore restitution must be made. Environmental justice says man is responsible for all of nature's woes: global warming, now called climate change, air and water pollution, famine, etc. Consequently, it is critical that all of man's activities be severely controlled, of course, by the government. Since Americans do value their environment, it allows the sustainability to use environmental justice to effectively convince Americans that in order to save their planet, they must give up their individual rights for the greater good. However, if Americans cannot be convinced to go along voluntarily, there is always ways to regulate compliance. For example, there is the precautionary principle, Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration, that allows the government to use the environment as a hammer. This principle says that if there is the slightest chance that an activity of man may harm the environment, then that activity must be stopped through regulations, legislation, whatever. The Keystone Pipeline is a perfect example of that. You say, this is just hokum. Well, while you're absolutely right, that doesn't mean millions of Americans don't believe this and are going along with this. So how has sustainable development been swallowed by so many Americans? Through indoctrination, regulation, intimidation, and outright destruction of our culture. Indoctrination is a tool used to soften up citizens to make them receptive to the transformation of a free world to a sustainable socialist world. Think of all the commercials, the advertisements, the nature shows you have seen pushing the green agenda. All the articles on by biased media pushing the 3 E's. Even various churches push the 3 E's. And let's not forget the schools and colleges that have curricula that has Agenda 21 ideas deeply embedded, which are designed to create good global citizens that will willingly give up their individual constitutional rights for the common good in order to protect the environment. You combine all of these strategies with the overly generous and trusting nature of many Americans and the reality that other Americans are paying no attention at all, and you can understand why sustainable development policies have soaked into the fiber of American thinking. Unfortunately, efforts to control us now extend beyond the federal government. Grants from the federal government, as well as lobbying by non-governmental organizations, help move sustainable development policies into the state and then down into the local governments. At this point in time, there are virtually no state or local governments that do not have some type of sustainable development regulations on their books. Regulations do not exist without directives to force compliance. So at this time, all across America, there is a tidal wave of regulations and associated penalties for non-compliance to implemented Agenda 21 policies. A particularly vicious regulation is called amortization of non-conforming use. This regulation uses green home codes and applies them to older homes. Regardless of whether the homeowner can afford to pay for the upgrades, the cost of compliance will exceed the value of the home. Additionally, mortgage companies will not finance houses that do not conform to these new regulations. Either way, this will have negative consequences on individual home ownership and for residential housing market at large. An equally scary regulation is likely coming down the pike, one that will force homeowners to pay a tax based on the amount of impervious surface located on their property. This regulation is based on the idea that impervious surfaces like roofs, concrete or asphalt driveways are preventing rainwater from absorbing into the ground. I know, I don't even think this is the craziest stuff that's going on. This is just one of the crazy things going on. Hence, the property owner has altered the flow of Mother Nature's processes. This then causes that precautionary principle to kick in. If there is any chance that these impervious surfaces will cause harm to the environment, you, the homeowner, must be held responsible. Then you have the activist judges who play a critical part in sustainable development. It is the activist judge's job to prevent any challenges to these sustainable development policies from being successful. Our culture and constitution have been under attack for a very long time. This too is no accident. The United States is the only country where the Constitution is based on God-given rights. The fewer people who believe in God, the fewer people who will care that we have God-given rights affirmed in the Constitution. Further, a population that does not have a strong moral code is more easily led by a centralized government. Add to this that the population has been educated in their schools to be good global citizens who value the common good instead of ones who value individual rights in the free market, then the population may willingly go into a socialist one-world order without a whimper. This explains why many people today will fight harder to protect an endangered species of animals than they will to stop the killing of unborn children. This one example shows how successful sustainable development tactics are, as they have gotten the human population to value animal life over its own. Of course, it is impossible to create a one-world government if borders are not eliminated. You may ask yourself, are the European countries really sovereign anymore now that they have formed the European Union? After all, they all share the same currency, have a free flow of people across their borders, share many of the same regulations and socialist policies. Then there's North American continent, where treaties like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, and our very porous borders threaten the sovereignty of the United States. You might ask yourself, if countries voluntarily surrender their national borders with other countries to make a larger governmental entity, would that not make it just that much easier to combine these blocks into a one-world government? There are also boundaries between local governmental entities, like cities and county boundaries. These too are under attack. To understand this, we must not forget that the United States government was designed to be strongest at a local level. By creating federal policies of taxation that cash-starve the local governments are easy to bribe with grant money. And not just grant money from the states and federal governments, but also from the regional governments. Regional governments are cropping up at an amazing speed. There are over a dozen of them in Ohio. Might these regional governments, with their unelected boards, using our tax dollars, over time, strip away the sovereignty of our state, city, and county governments, thereby undermining our 250-year-old political structure and consequently make it easier to ease the United States into the global governance system. Still, you say, we're a strong country and we would never allow the loss of our sovereignty. But how many Americans are aware that much of our sovereignty has already been lost through Article 51 of the United Nations Charter? And then there's the destruction of our economy. We, like Greece, will be dancing to the tune that others play if we allow ourselves to be pushed over the edge financially and cannot pay our debts to foreign countries, cannot maintain a strong military, cannot pay our enormous entitlements. At that point, it is not conceivable that outside forces could force us to merge with them, or perhaps our own people willingly, in a belief that the United Nations is our friend, push for that solution. So up to this point, I have tried to explain how the United Nations is using the 3 E's to justify what they do while indoctrinating us, regulating us, in order to destroy our value system, our borders, our economy, and our Constitution, with the ultimate goal of creating a global governance system where all human behavior and wealth is under strict control. But there is one more critical and very personal area of sustainable development that must be discussed. That is the taking of private rural lands by the government, which in turn will force more and more of our population into, the UN's term, not mine, into human settlements. Through many venues, including but not limited to local, state, and federal regulations and programs, private property rights of rural landowners are incrementally being taken. This is in compliance with the Biodiversity Treaty, which was one of the treaties foisted on America at the Rio Conference in 1992. The treaty, while not fully ratified, is being implemented through, you guessed it, the executive branch of government. Also known as the Wildlands Project, its intent to gain control over and then return at least 50% of the rural land in the United States to the condition that predates the arrival of Christopher Columbus. The strategies used to remove the landowner from his land include, but are not limited to, the following. Land is taken by denying water and or grazing rights to farmers and ranchers, or limiting their use of pesticides and herbicides. This over time will force farmers out of business, causing the land to possibly fall into the hands of the federal government. Land is taken when wilderness areas and parks are created. Not only is the land off limits, but the mineral resources underground or forests above also will be made off limits from development by the governance system. Land is taken when any trickle of water or puddle is declared a wetland. This allows the EPA to prevent the development of the land and the land around it. This makes the land worthless and easy to acquire by sundry entities, including the government. Land is taken when endangered species are located in a forest. Then large areas all around this area are made off limits to development. Again, the land loses value and easily acquired by the government. And of course, land is taken directly through eminent domain. And then land is taken when a land trust purchases private property rights from a landowner, a farmer, a landowner, whatever, for promises from the landowner to do certain environmentally friendly things. The landowner and his heirs are then able to stay there in perpetuity. Unfortunately, over time, the land trust may make more and more environmental demands on the landowner until the landowner can no longer make a living off of his land. With all the restrictions placed on the land, no one but the government may be willing to buy it. These agreements are called conservation easements. Land is taken when urban boundaries are created around town. They may not even call them urban boundaries. They do go by a variety of names, but they may not even name it. But whether they name it or not, beyond this boundary, development may not occur or utilities may not be provided. This destroys the economic value of the rural lands outside of this boundary. Many of our comprehensive land use plans in existence today have policies that create this scenario. And land can be taken when the government declares land part of a floodplain and then forces the homeowner to give up their homes. The homes are then destroyed and the land declared undevelopable. The government gets a 2-for if the land is along a river. Then not only is the land off limits to development, the government has total control of the river and the priceless water it contains. Once folks are forced off the land, out of default, they are then forced into human settlements where their behavior can be more easily monitored and controlled. One venue for monitoring changing human behavior is called smart growth. To discourage the use of automobiles and consequently the use of fossil fuels, there is a deliberate effort to create congestion on roads by not adding extra lanes to heavily traveled roads or by not creating new roads. Allowing bikes to share these roads further adds to the problem. Today in many towns, bike paths and walking paths are being pushed by city planners. These planners are laying the infrastructure for future human settlements where the main mode of travel will be bicycling and walking. To discourage the building of new homes, new green codes are created to make it simply too costly to build. Or if the home is built, it will be much smaller or lack a garage. The garageless home, of course, will discourage ownership of a car. To change our patterns of consumption, utilities like water, electric, natural gas, etc., will be heavily monitored, and a cost curve created that forces conservation. Further, if a device like a smart meter is installed, the electric company not only monitors, but can shut off your appliances remotely if the usage exceeds the utility's idea of acceptable. To discourage the use of fossil fuels, the federal government will put so many regulations on mining, refining, and delivery of fossil fuels so that at some point the alternative energies will become competitive. The result, artificially high energy and forced conservation. Reduction in family size is a natural consequence of all of these. Because development can only occur on a limited amount of land in town, land prices, land taxes, and congestion will increase, while the size of homes, the ability to own cars and travel, ability to use energy, and afford children will decrease. Humans, in essence, will be caged and controlled, while the bulk of the United States will be rewilded back to nature, where the animals will roam free. The last area that must be brought under control by the United Nations is the business sector, where there is an incredible wealth to capture and control. This is done through public-private partnerships, PPPs. Public-private partnerships turn corporations into willing advocates for Agenda 21 policies. This occurs when government selects certain companies to receive preferential treatment, like subsidies, front-of-the-line permits, large contracts from the federal government, etc. In exchange, the company agrees to further the government's agenda, let's say the green agenda. The choosing of winners by the government using our tax dollars gives these companies, usually large companies, such an advantage that other, probably smaller companies cannot compete. Eventually, there are only larger companies who answer to the government and not to the free market. There is no coincidence at work when General Electric stopped making a safe incandescent light bulb that was manufactured in America and instead started making mercury-laden bulbs overseas. Through this quid pro quo, the federal government achieves economic equity by redistributing wealth overseas, while GE's taxes are greatly reduced. Everyone wins, except the American citizen, who pays more taxes and gets a questionable product at a higher price. Again, in summary, while the animals in this brave new world will roam free, the people will not. Mankind will instead live a subsistence existence much like that of the 19th century rather than the 21st. However, at least in the 19th century, there was room to move and breathe, and a hope for a better tomorrow. In this new smart world, man will be stacked on top of man like cordwood as he tries to scratch out a living off of the communal land granted to him by an oh-so-benevolent government with little hope of improvement or freedom. Now, I'm not done, but I would like you all to take a deep breath. I know I can use one. All right. I am not a mind reader. If I had to guess, I would guess right now a lot of you are wondering where the closest supply of Allen is located.
Jack Daniels.
Yeah, all right, Jack Daniels. Your preferred choice there. All right. It's still a free world. I'm not telling you what to do. This has not been a pleasant speech to listen to. That is why I'm going to end it on a series of positive notes. The first positive is an obvious negative. Agenda 21 includes a huge number of issues, from the Constitution under attack, to open borders, to the tanking of the economy. So while this is true, knowing that if you connect all these dots, all of these are just a symptom of a bigger problem, Agenda 21. If you can stop Agenda 21, you can create an environment that will allow us to more readily fix these symptoms. A second positive is that sustainable development is a unifying issue. I cannot believe that any, but a very small portion of America, if they truly understood the end game, and again, it is not an environmental movement, it is a political movement designed to control youth. If everyone in America truly understood this end game, they would all want to unite against this problem. Proof of that is that recently Glenn Beck, a staunch conservative, co-wrote a book, Agenda 21, while Rosa Koire, a Democrat, wrote the book Behind the Green Mask, UN Agenda 21. That brings me to the third piece of good news. Unlike folks like Don Casey and Tom DeWeese, who have fought Agenda 21 for 20 years without much support, Agenda 21 is finally coming out of the shadows and getting on the radar. More and more books are being written. There's more and more information on the internet. And again, thanks to patrons like Don Casey, we finally have a state, the state of Alabama, which passed the first anti-Agenda 21 state law. And in Ohio, Marysville is considering passing a resolution addressing their concerns about Agenda 21. If you live near Marysville or know anyone in Marysville, please give them any support that you can in this regard. Also, there are noises amongst Ohio's representatives that they are considering co-sponsoring an anti-Agenda 21 bill. If you do nothing else today because of this presentation, please call your Ohio reps or Ohio senators and ask them to help co-sponsor an anti-Agenda 21 bill in 2013. And make that call frequently, by the way, not just today. All right, this brings me to the last piece of good news. You are here today. No matter your talents or your situation, you can make a difference. I will give you a perfect example of how one person made a difference. Just before Thanksgiving last year, which obviously just several months ago, I received a call from a woman named Judy Jackson. It turned out that Judy had just gone to her first Agenda 21 presentation and was just horrified at what she heard was going to be happening to her country. She immediately knew she had to do something. She had heard that I give Agenda 21 speeches, and she promptly called me, asked if I would give a speech. However, during the conversation, she mentioned she thought she could get Don Casey to come up from Alabama. And I said, "Why are you calling me?" You know? So that's exactly what she did. Now, not that that wasn't pretty ambitious and fearless for someone who had never done anything like that before, but with some networking with some other conservative groups around the state, this one presentation by Don has turned into a 7-day circuit to all corners of the state. So what I'm trying to say is that we are all, each of us, like a pebble being thrown into the water creating ripples. If enough pebbles are thrown at once, we will not just create a ripple, we'll make a tidal wave. And by so doing, we can remove these dreadful policies from our country. I want to thank you today for coming and listening to my speech and to Don's presentation. And God bless America.